Then suddenly 1993 came around, September 1993, the Oslo Peace Process, Oslo Peace Accord was signed. Some of us are old enough to remember, it was the White House lawn, President Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Peace Process, and many people thought, this is really happening. The Soviet Union already fell, apartheid in South Africa fell, this is next. What many people did not realize is that by 1993, there was no more chance to establish a Palestinian state anyway, because there was no more West Bank. The West Bank was already fully integrated into Israel. The purpose of the Oslo process was not to bring peace. The purpose of Oslo was to bring the Palestinians to surrender, to further fragment the Palestinian society, the Palestinian politics, allow Israel to establish a stronger hold on the country, a stronger hold on the resources and the people. Which is why it led to nothing. For the last 2 decades, these peace talks have led to nothing because they were not meant to bring about peace. They were an attempt to bring the Palestinians to surrender. And darn it, they won't surrender, so we have no peace. The Oslo peace process was supposed to bring to a final solution within 5 years. From 1993, that would have been 1998. In the summer of 2000, when Bill Clinton was almost out of office, he decided to bring the parties together, and they met at Camp David. It was supposed to be the second Camp David. And they sat there and sat there and sat there for days and days and days, and when they came out, they had no agreement. And again, some of us are old enough to remember when they came out, Bill Clinton said, well, the Palestinians gave some, but the Israelis gave more. In other words, basically, the Palestinians are not willing to make concessions. Yasser Arafat was not willing to make concessions. And then the Israelis came out and said, now we know the true face of the Palestinians. They're all terrorists. They want to destroy us and so on. Now, claiming that the Palestinians, particularly Yasser Arafat, were not willing to make concessions is a very interesting claim. Because under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, the Palestinians were ready to give up 80% of Palestine, establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but no less than the West Bank and Gaza, the entire West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. They're willing to recognize and make peace with the very state that destroyed Palestine and forgo the right of the refugees, Palestinian refugees, to ever return. That is not a concession? Has anybody ever made a bigger concession than that? But Yasser Arafat refused to go any further. He refused to surrender completely, which is why he was vilified, and 4 years later, he died with Israeli tanks surrounding his office in Ramallah. In fact, I think it's fair to say that for 30 years, the last 3 decades, up to his death, Yasser Arafat was the most consistent voice for peace in the Middle East. He supported and established this whole idea. He was behind this whole idea of the two-state solution from the mid-1970s, and he was consistent in his willingness to make peace with Israel based on that, but not anything less. But Israel's not interested. Israel was never interested. In fact, there's never been an Israeli peace proposal. Because in terms of Zionist thinking, it's a zero-sum game. The land is ours. End of story. So I think this is important in the context when Israelis like to say they want peace and they try to bring peace and there's nobody to talk to remind them that this is not true. Now, I talked a little bit about the Palestinian prisoners. This is a picture of Samar Isawi and his sister Shireen. Samar Isawi holds the record of the number of days being on hunger strike and surviving. And now his sister, who is an attorney, is also in prison. Both of them, by the way, with no charges. And I think it's important to remember that probably one of the most important but the least talked about issues is the issue of the Palestinian prisoners. Israel holds thousands and thousands of Palestinian prisoners in its jails. which of course it calls them security prisoners, it calls them terrorists, but the vast majority, and this is according to Israeli sources, the vast majority of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails have not been charged with acts of violence. Have not been charged with acts of violence, the vast majority. They are political prisoners. And then you've got hundreds and hundreds of them that have not been charged with anything at all. Now we have to remember, we're talking about the Israeli military courts. According to the Israeli military law, a kid with a rock is a terrorist. And we're talking about thousands of prisoners that have not been charged with acts of violence by the low standards even of the Israeli military courts. And then you've got the administrative prisoners who are not charged with anything. So even by the low standards of the Israeli military court, there was nothing with which to charge these people. Yet they sit in prison indefinitely. Indefinitely, some of them for years. So there was a hunger strike a couple of years ago, and now we have hunger strikers again. How is it that especially a country like Switzerland doesn't kick out the Israeli ambassador? I don't know. So many violations of human rights. And pull back and bring back the Swiss ambassador from Tel Aviv. Now, besides all of that, the world recognizes the rights of people to resist. There is a United Nations resolution that says that the world community, the struggle of people under colonial, alien domination and racist regimes for the implementation of their right to self-determination and independence is legitimate. There is no better characterization of Israel than this: colonial and alien domination and racist regime. Almost by its own definition, that's what Israel is. Where the world recognizes the right of people to resist. Now, what's interesting is, and we talk about the Palestinian context, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance, as we see reflected in the prison population, has by and large been unarmed, nonviolent resistance. The armed portion of the Palestinian resistance has always been the smaller portion, although it gets all the news. But the vast majority of Palestinian resistance over the years, and particularly even more so today, has been nonviolent, unarmed resistance. Not by chance, but by principle. And yet again, it's one of these issues that nobody talks about. Thousands and thousands of people sitting in jails. Prisoners sitting in jails. So another portion of the more personal aspect of the story, and a more personal aspect of the book, has to do with my sister's daughter. My sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem in 1997. She was 13 years old. Now, in Israel, of course, as you can imagine, when something like this happens, of course, it's big news. In this case, it was, of course, bigger news because here's the granddaughter of an famous Israeli general, the granddaughter of Miko Peled, killed by Palestinians. And not only was he a famous general, but he became an advocate for Palestinian rights. Of course, this was big news. I was living in the U.S. at the time, so I took the first plane home. When I reached my sister's apartment, it was filled with people who came to express their sorrow, but also filled with reporters. Every news agency around the world, every language that you possibly can imagine was there. And the usual questions are always asked about retaliation, about revenge, about who's responsible, and what do we do with them, and how do we show them, and so forth. And when my sister, I know, was here, some of you may have met her, my sister Nurit came out and spoke. She said two very interesting things, two, I think, earth-shattering things. In terms of retaliation and revenge, she said, I don't want to hear anything about that. She said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. No real mother would want to see this kind of grief happen to any other mother. And she quoted a line from a famous Hebrew poet, Bialik, who wrote that even the devil himself couldn't invent a vengeance that's appropriate for the death of a child. And both she and her husband Rami said, in terms of who's responsible, they said, well, who is it that's maintaining this brutal oppression against the Palestinians? Who is taking away their land, destroying their homes, denying them of water, throwing their fathers and brothers in jail, shooting their children in the schools, denying them any sense of future or hope? Who's doing all this? And both of them said, we hold the Israeli government directly responsible for our daughter's death. Because what do we expect? That we maintain this brutal regime and there will be no price to be paid.